I'm Claire, 28 female. I live in a small but comfortable apartment in the city, a little sanctuary filled with plants and books that I've curated over the years. By day, I work as a cybersecurity analyst, a job that's all about finding patterns in chaos and identifying threats before they can do any damage. It's a world of logic and precision, which for a long time was the perfect counterbalance to my seemingly perfect relationship. I thought I had it all, but it turns out the biggest threat wasn't hidden in a line of code. It was sitting across the dinner table from me, smiling like he had the world on a string. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. Our story, or what I thought was our story, began 2 years ago at a tech conference. Arthur was a speaker, a senior financial advisor for a prestigious firm, and he commanded the room with an easy, almost arrogant confidence. He was handsome, sharp, and ambitious, everything I thought I wanted in a partner. I was there representing my company, and during a networking session, he approached me. He said he was impressed by a question I'd asked during a panel on digital asset protection. We talked for hours, and by the end of the night, he had my number. Our first date was 2 days later, and from there, it was a whirlwind. Arthur was charming in a way that felt like a performance. He planned extravagant dates, bought thoughtful, expensive gifts, and always knew the right thing to say. He'd tell me I was the smartest, most beautiful woman he'd ever met, and I, wanting so badly to believe it, soaked it all in. My friends adored him, especially my best friend Martha. "He's a catch, Claire," she'd say. "He treats you like a queen." And for a long time, it felt like he did. He was my biggest cheerleader, or so he seemed. When I got a promotion, he bought me a designer briefcase. When I was stressed about a project, he'd have dinner waiting for me when I got home. But looking back now, through the clear, sharp lens of hindsight, the cracks were always there. They were subtle hairline fractures in the perfect facade he had built around us. There were the little comments disguised as jokes about my clothes. "Another black dress, Claire. You should try some color. Live a little." Or about my job, still staring at green text on a black screen. I couldn't do it. I need to interact with actual, important people. I'd laugh it off, telling myself he was just teasing, that his world of high-stakes finance was simply different from mine. I was logical, he was a showman. We balanced each other out. Then there were the times his phone would be face down on the table always. If I even glanced at it when it buzzed, he'd snatch it up with a tight smile and say, "Just work, you know how it is." I did know how it was. My job was demanding, too. I gave him the benefit of the doubt because that's what you do when you love someone. You trust them. You believe in the person they present to you. His friends, like Jack, were cut from the same cloth. They were loud, brash men who talked about money, cars, and women as if they were all items in a catalog to be acquired and displayed. I never felt comfortable around them. They had a way of looking at me, a sort of sizing up glance that made my skin crawl. When I mentioned it to Arthur, he'd wave it away. "They're just guys, Claire. That's how they are. Don't be so sensitive." So I learned to be less sensitive. I learned to ignore the little pangs of doubt, to quiet the voice in my head that whispered something wasn't right. I focused on the good things, the weekend getaways, the cozy nights in watching movies, the way he'd hold my hand in public as if to show the world I was his. We talked about the future, about moving in together, about a timeline that was always conveniently 6 months away. He painted a beautiful picture, and I was so in love with the canvas that I didn't notice the paint was chipping. The biggest red flag, the one that I see so clearly now, was his subtle control. He never liked it when I went out with my own friends without him. He'd feign disappointment. "Oh, you're going out with Martha again? I was hoping we could have a quiet night in." It wasn't a demand, but a gentle, manipulative tug on my heartstrings, making me feel guilty for having a life outside of him. And more often than not, I'd cancel my plans to appease him, to keep the peace in our perfect little world. My job requires me to be meticulous, to see the patterns others miss. It's about data points, anomalies, and deviations from the baseline. In my personal life, I had abandoned all of that training. Arthur was my baseline, and I refused to see the glaring anomalies in his behavior. He'd often talk about his exes, never by name, but as cautionary tales. My asked girlfriend was so insecure, he'd say with a sigh. It was exhausting. I'm so glad you're not like that. It was a threat and a compliment rolled into one, a warning that any sign of insecurity or doubt from me would land me in the same category as the crazy exes. It was a masterful way to keep me from questioning him, and it worked. I prided myself on being the cool girlfriend, the one who wasn't needy, who didn't pry. In reality, I was just the compliant girlfriend, the one who was too afraid of losing the fantasy to face the reality. He had conditioned me to accept the version of him he wanted me to see, and I had become a willing participant in my own deception. The man I thought I knew was a carefully crafted illusion, a character in a play where I was the only one who didn't have the script. And the final act was about to begin, under the dim, unforgiving lights of a restaurant called La Belle Vie. La Belle Vie, which translates to the beautiful life, was Arthur's favorite restaurant. It was one of those places with white tablecloths, ridiculously small portions, and a wine list that looked more like a novel. It was a stage for him, a place to be seen. He had made a reservation for our 2-year anniversary, and despite the unsettling feeling that had been growing in my gut for weeks, I was determined to make it a perfect evening. I spent an hour getting ready, choosing a simple, elegant black dress, one he'd previously made a comment about, and styling my hair exactly how he liked it. I wanted to erase any tension, to prove that we were still the perfect couple he always claimed we were. When I arrived, he was already at the table with his friend Jack. My heart sank. This was supposed to be our anniversary dinner. Jack was in the neighborhood, thought he'd join us for a quick drink to celebrate, Arthur said with a wide grin, not a hint of apology in his tone. Jack stood up and gave me a perfunctory air kiss, his eyes scanning my dress with a faint smirk. Looking sharp, Claire, he said, the compliment feeling more like an evaluation. I forced a smile and sat down, the beautiful life feeling a lot less beautiful. The quick drink turned into Jack staying for the appetizers than the main course. The conversation was dominated by them, their latest deals, the cars they were thinking of buying, a golf trip they were planning. I was a spectator at my own anniversary dinner, occasionally thrown a question like, "How's the computer stuff going, Claire?" To which they'd nod vaguely before returning to their own world. Arthur was performing for Jack, his voice louder, his gestures more expansive, and his attention toward me shifted. The loving glances were replaced with a kind of patronizing amusement. He began making little digs, all framed as jokes for Jack's benefit. When I talked about a complex project I was leading at work, he cut me off. "Don't bore us with the technical jargon, honey. Just tell us if you're saving the world from the bad guys," he said, winking at Jack, who chuckled obligingly. Each comment was a small paper cut, insignificant on its own, but they were starting to bleed. The final, fatal blow came during dessert. Jack was telling a story about a woman he'd briefly dated. "Honestly, she was great, but I just couldn't do it. She let herself go, you know? It's important to maintain standards." Arthur nodded in solemn agreement, looking at Jack with a profound sense of brotherhood. Then he turned his gaze to me. It wasn't a loving look. It was cold, appraising, and full of something I couldn't yet name but now recognize as contempt. He let the silence hang for a moment before speaking, his voice carrying just enough for the nearby tables to hear. "I know exactly what you mean," he said, not taking his eyes off me. "It's like you start dating a 10 and you wake up one day and she's a 6, at best." My fork clattered against my plate. The blood drained from my face. Jack looked uncomfortable for the first time all night, shifting in his seat. I stared at Arthur, waiting for him to laugh, to say it was a twisted, horrible joke. But he didn't. He just held my gaze, a cruel little smile playing on his lips. "What?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. He leaned back in his chair, gesturing at me with his wine glass. "Look at you, Claire, the same boring dress, the same boring hair, there's no effort. You've gotten comfortable." He then turned to Jack, his voice rising in volume. "I mean, honestly, in front of your friends, you want to be proud of who you're with, but looking at her now, she's just kind of ugly." The word hung in the air, sharp and heavy. Ugly. It echoed in the sudden silence of our corner of the restaurant. I could feel the eyes of the other diners on me, their pity and curiosity like physical blows. I felt naked, exposed, and utterly broken. My mind went blank. All the love, the memories, the future I had envisioned with this man, it all evaporated. And that single, brutal moment, I saw him not as the man I loved, but as a stranger, a monster wearing a familiar face. Jack cleared his throat and mumbled something about needing to leave, hastily shaking Arthur's hand and avoiding my eyes as he all but fled the restaurant. We were alone. That was uncalled for, I managed to say, my voice trembling. Arthur scoffed. Was it, or was it just the truth? I'm tired of pretending, Claire. This isn't working for me anymore. He stood up, throwing his napkin on the table. We're done. He started to walk away. I sat there, paralyzed by shock and humiliation. Then he paused, turned back, and delivered the final, crushing line, loud enough for everyone to hear. A girl like you should be grateful I even dated you. And with that, he walked out of the restaurant, leaving me alone at a table for 3, with a half-eaten dessert and the bill for a lavish anniversary dinner I had just been brutally uninvited from. The waitress approached cautiously, her face a mask of sympathy. "Ma'am, will you be taking care of this?" she asked softly. I looked at the bill, over $400. For a moment, I felt a surge of panic, followed by a wave of white-hot anger. But then something else settled in. A strange, chilling calm. The part of my brain that I used for work, the analytical, problem-solving part, kicked into gear. He thought he had won. He thought he had broken me, left me crying and financially stranded. He had no idea who he had just messed with. I took out my credit card, paid the bill, and even left a generous tip. As I walked out of La Belle Vie, I didn't cry. I smiled. I calmly waited. The game wasn't over. He had just made the first move, and I was about to make the last. The walk home from the restaurant was surreal. The city lights blurred around me, the sounds of traffic faded into a dull hum. The humiliation was a physical weight, a sickness in my stomach, but beneath it, the cold, analytical part of my mind was already booting up. The tears I expected to fall never came. Instead, my brain was buzzing, replaying not just the horror of the dinner, but the last 2 years. It was like a system diagnostic, scanning for the initial point of corruption. Arthur's words, "A girl like you should be grateful," echoed in my head, but they weren't just an insult anymore. They were a clue. That level of cruelty doesn't just appear out of nowhere. It's cultivated. This wasn't a spontaneous breakup, it was a calculated execution. When I got back to my apartment, I didn't collapse onto the couch. I went straight to my office, a small room with a powerful custom-built PC and 3 monitors. This was my domain, my sanctuary of logic and order. For 2 years, I had kept my work life and my personal life strictly separate, honoring a boundary Arthur himself had encouraged. "We don't need to talk about work all the time," he'd said early on. Now I realized that boundary wasn't for our relationship's health, it was for his protection. He knew what I did for a living, but he had no concept of what I was capable of. He just thought I played with code. He was about to find out what that really meant. My first step wasn't vengeance, it was verification. I needed to understand the why. The breakup was brutal, public, and designed to inflict maximum damage. Why? People don't do that unless they're trying to create a narrative, one where they are the victim or the justified party. He needed to paint me as worthless to absolve himself of something. But what? My mind immediately went to the most obvious answer. There was someone else. The way he'd been so dismissive, the comments about my appearance, it was classic cheaters' rhetoric, devaluing the current partner to justify their betrayal. But I needed proof. I didn't operate on feelings, I operated on data. I started with the basics, social media. His profiles were pristine, curated showcases of success. Photos of us were still there, but I noticed a pattern. Over the last 6 months, I was in fewer and fewer of them. Group shots where I was on the edge or solo pictures of him on business trips. I scrolled through his followers and a few new names caught my eye, mostly women with impossibly perfect, influencer-style profiles. It was a needle in a haystack. Then I remembered something. A few months ago, he'd been complaining about his laptop being slow, and I, in an attempt to be a helpful girlfriend, had offered to clean it up. I'd installed some optimization software, and while I was at it, a keylogger. At the time, my justification was purely professional paranoia. I had told him it was a security tool to monitor for malware, which wasn't entirely a lie. In reality, it was a piece of custom software I'd written. It was discreet, untraceable by standard antivirus programs, and it logged every keystroke, every website visited, every password entered. I had never once looked at the logs. I trusted him. It felt like a violation of the very principles I held. But he had shattered that trust. He had declared war. I logged into my secure server where the data was being sent. The file was massive, 2 months of his entire digital life. I took a deep breath and opened it. The first hour was a blur of work emails, financial reports, and boring web browsing. I almost convinced myself I was wrong, that I was the crazy, paranoid girlfriend he always warned me about. And then I found it. It started with searches on LinkedIn. He was looking up a woman named Isabel Morrow. She was a vice president at a rival investment firm. Her profile picture showed a stunning woman in her early 30s with fiery red hair and a smile that radiated ruthless confidence. Then came the emails. Not from his work account, he wasn't that stupid, but from a private webmail account I never knew he had. The password was Legacy1, the name of his first big investment fund, arrogant and predictable. The emails between Arthur and Isabel were a punch to the gut. They started professionally, then quickly became flirtatious, then explicitly romantic. They had been seeing each other for at least 4 months. They had gone on trips together, the business trips he'd told me about. He'd sent her gifts, the same kind of expensive, thoughtless trinkets he used to buy for me. He wrote her long, poetic emails, calling her his equal, his intellectual match, a goddess among mortals. The words he used to describe me in those emails were chilling. I was the comfortable one, the starter girlfriend, sweet but unambitious, and holding him back. He was building a narrative for Isabel, painting himself as a man trapped in a dull, lifeless relationship, waiting for a woman like her to rescue him. The worst part was reading his descriptions of our life together. A dinner I'd spent hours cooking was another boring night in with the girlfriend. A weekend trip I'd planned to the mountains was a mandatory couples thing I couldn't get out of. He was twisting our shared history into a prison sentence from which Isabel was his parole. The final email, sent the morning of our anniversary, was the nail in the coffin. "Tonight's the night," he wrote to her. "I'm finally ending it with Claire. I'll make it clean and quick. Then I'm all yours. Meet me at the Oak Room at 10? The Oak Room was a bar 2 blocks from La Belle Vie. He had planned it. He was going to humiliate me and then run straight into her arms for a victory drink. The sheer, cold-blooded cruelty of it took my breath away. He hadn't just cheated. He had orchestrated my public destruction as a final gift to his new woman. The breadcrumbs hadn't just led me to another woman, they had led me to the truth of his character. He wasn't just a cheater. He was a sociopath. And I, the quiet, unambitious computer girl, was about to show him what a real legacy system failure looked like. The initial shock of discovering the affair quickly morphed into a cold, hard resolve. The pain was still there, a throbbing wound in my chest, but my analytical mind had taken over, encasing my emotions in a protective shell of logic. I now had the what and the who. What I needed to understand was the how. Arthur was a senior financial advisor. His entire career was built on a foundation of trust, reputation, and the appearance of impeccable judgment. He managed the wealth of very important, very private people. For him to be so reckless in his personal life suggested a level of arrogance that likely bled into his professional one. My gut told me the affair with Isabel wasn't just a romantic betrayal. It was a symptom of a much larger disease of deceit. I spent the next 2 days in a caffeine-fueled trance, sleeping only a few hours on the couch in my office. My best friend, Martha, was frantic. SH. He'd been calling and texting since I sent her a brief message saying Arthur and I had broken up. I finally answered her call, my voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Claire, oh my God, are you okay? What happened? That monster isn't answering his phone." I told her a sanitized version that he broke up with me at dinner. I left out the public humiliation and the discovery of the affair. I couldn't bear the pity in her voice yet. I just needed her to know I was safe. "I'm okay, Martha, I promise. I just need some time to process. I'm just working on something." She was worried but respected my need for space. "Okay, honey, but you call me the second you need anything. I'll bring over ice cream and junk food, and we can burn everything he ever gave you." I smiled for the first time in days. "I have a better idea," I said, and hung up. With the keylogger data as my starting point, I began to map out Arthur's entire digital ecosystem. It wasn't just about the affair anymore. I was conducting a full-scale cybersecurity audit on his life. He used the same weak password, Legacy 1, for almost everything: his personal email, his social media, his online banking, even his cloud storage. It was amateur hour. Inside his cloud drive, I hit the jackpot. It was a digital treasure trove of his arrogance and carelessness. He had folders for everything, meticulously organized. And in a folder cleverly named Old Tax Docs, I found something else entirely. It was a complete shadow ledger. For years, Arthur had been running a sophisticated scheme. He had a select group of special clients, ones who were looking to hide money, to make investments that were off the books. He was using a complex network of shell corporations and offshore accounts to launder money for these clients, taking a hefty percentage for himself. The ledger detailed every transaction, every account number, every name. It was a stunningly detailed record of his crimes. He was not just a cheating boyfriend. He was a criminal, a con artist hiding in plain sight in a bespoke suit. He was an architect of deceit on a scale I could never have imagined. But the ledger was only half the story. I needed to understand the full scope of his operation. I cross-referenced the names in the ledger with his work emails and contact lists. One name kept popping up: Jack. His loyal, smirking friend was not just a social acquaintance, he was a key player. Jack, the real estate developer, was the one acquiring properties through the shell corporations, flipping them, and cleaning the money. Their whole friendship was a business arrangement built on mutual criminality. The golf trips, the expensive dinners, they were business meetings. My presence had been nothing more than window dressing, a prop to make Arthur look like a stable, trustworthy guy with a loving girlfriend. The final piece of the puzzle was Isabel. Why her? Why a VP at a rival firm? I dug into the emails between them again, this time looking for keywords related to finance, deals, and clients. And there it was. She wasn't just his new girlfriend, she was his next business partner. He was feeding her insider information from his firm, giving her tips on trades and client movements. In return, she was providing him with confidential data from her own company. They were engaging in corporate espionage, planning to use their combined illicit knowledge to poach clients and start their own consultancy firm once they had enough capital. The capital, of course, being the money Arthur was skimming from his clients. His plan was diabolical in its simplicity. He would build his secret slush fund through his money laundering scheme with Jack. He would use Isabel to gain a competitive advantage and a portfolio of stolen clients. And he would discard me, the boring girlfriend, because I no longer fit the image of the high-flying power broker he intended to become. He needed a partner who was as corrupt and ambitious as he was. The public humiliation at the restaurant now made perfect sense. It wasn't just about breaking up with me, it was about discrediting me. By painting me as a pathetic, unattractive woman, he was preemptively neutralizing any threat I might pose. Who would believe the crazy, scorned ex-girlfriend if she ever tried to speak out? He had underestimated me on every conceivable level. He thought I was a liability to be managed. He had no idea I was the one who had just audited his entire crooked life and was now holding the kill switch. The architect had built a beautiful house of cards, and I was about to introduce it to a hurricane. With the full picture of Arthur's criminal enterprise laid bare, my mission became crystal clear. This was no longer about a broken heart or a simple act of revenge. This was about justice. He wasn't just a bad boyfriend. He was a predator who used and manipulated everyone around him for personal gain, breaking laws and ruining lives in the process. My pain was real. But it was just one small part of a much larger pattern of destruction. Exposing him wasn't just for me, it was for everyone he had or would have wronged. But I couldn't just dump a folder of illegally obtained data on the internet. That would be chaotic and could even backfire on me legally. I had to be smarter. I had to be surgical. I had to build an airtight case, brick by digital brick, and deliver it to the people who could actually bring him down. My first step was to organize the evidence. I created a secure, encrypted partition on my hard drive and began sorting the data into distinct categories. Money laundering, the shadow ledger, offshore account details, transaction records, corporate espionage, the emails between Arthur and Isabel detailing their scheme, and real estate fraud, Jack's involvement, property deeds registered to shell corporations. It was like the most complex project I had ever managed at work, but infinitely more personal. I spent hours cross-referencing dates, times, and amounts, creating a timeline that showed exactly how the money flowed from his clients, through the shell companies, into Jack's properties, and finally into Arthur's personal offshore accounts. I was no longer a victim, I was a forensic investigator, and this was the case of my life. One of the shell corporations, named Apex Global Holdings, was used most frequently. A quick search revealed it was registered in a country known for its lax financial regulations. The listed director was a name I didn't recognize. However, using the digital footprint from Arthur's laptop, I found a scanned copy of a passport hidden in a temporary internet file. The name on the passport matched the director of Apex Global Holdings. The photo was of Arthur's seemingly sweet, unassuming cleaning lady, a woman in her late 60s who barely spoke English. He had stolen her identity to make her the face of his primary money laundering operation. This discovery sickened me more than anything else. He hadn't just betrayed me, he was exploiting the vulnerable, people who trusted him implicitly. This detail went into a special folder titled Human Cost. Next, I turned my attention to Isabel. She was a willing participant, and she needed to be exposed as well. I created a separate file on her, detailing her complicity. The emails were damning, showing she was not only receiving insider information but actively soliciting it. She was just as guilty as he was. My plan couldn't just take down Arthur, it had to take down his entire network. His power came from his connections, and I was going to sever every single one of them. The most critical part of my plan was to make the evidence admissible, or at least, to make it appear as if it had been obtained through legitimate channels. I couldn't just say, I used a keylogger I installed months ago. So, I created a new narrative. I began to construct a digital trail that would lead investigators to the truth without ever pointing back to me. I used a series of anonymized servers and VPNs to create a fictitious, whistleblower persona. I crafted an email from this persona, writing it as if I were a disgruntled junior analyst at Arthur's firm who had stumbled upon the truth. The email was a masterpiece of misdirection, filled with just enough technical detail to be credible, but vague enough about my identity to remain anonymous. This anonymous email would be my delivery mechanism. I prepared 3 separate packages. The first was for the board of directors and the head of compliance at Arthur's firm. This package focused on the corporate espionage and the insider trading with Isabel. It contained their emails, conveniently leaked from a misconfigured server, and a summary of the clients he was planning to poach. This would ensure his professional ruin. The second package was for the board of Isabel's firm. It was similar, highlighting her role in the scheme. Her career would be over. The third and most important package was for the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, the government agency responsible for investigating money laundering. This package was the motherlode, the full shadow ledger, the offshore account details, the evidence of Jack's real estate fraud, and the proof of the stolen identity. I laid it all out in a clear, concise report, complete with a flowchart of the money trail. I made it impossible for them to ignore. My final act of preparation was for Arthur himself. It was the only part of the plan that was purely for me. I compiled a small, curated selection of his emails with Isabel, the most romantic, poetic ones, and combined them with the most damning financial records. I put it all into a password-protected PDF file. The password was Ugly6. This was my personal signature, a final twist of the knife. This file wouldn't go to the authorities. It had a different destination. With all the packages prepared and the delivery systems in place, I sat back in my chair and looked at my monitors. The entire corrupt world Arthur had built was laid out before me, a complex web of lies and greed. I had the power to burn it all to the ground with a few simple clicks. There was no hesitation, no doubt. He had wanted me to feel small, worthless, and grateful. He was about to find out what I was truly grateful for. The skills he had so casually dismissed, the meticulous mind he never bothered to understand, and the opportunity he had just given me to be the architect of his downfall. I scheduled the anonymous emails to be sent simultaneously the next morning at 9:00 a.m. sharp. Then, I went to bed and slept more soundly than I had in months. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of calm I hadn't felt in years. There was no anxiety, no lingering sadness. There was only a quiet certainty. I made coffee, sat at my kitchen table, and watched the city come to life. At exactly 9:00 a.m., a script I had written sent the 3 anonymous emails, one to Arthur's firm, one to Isabel's firm, and one to the federal government. The first domino had been pushed. All I had to do now was wait. The fallout was faster and more spectacular than I could have ever imagined. Around 10:30 a.m., my friend Martha, the pediatric nurse, sent me a frantic text. "OMG CLAIR. You will not believe the gossip from the finance ward." One of her patients was the child of a senior partner at Arthur's firm. The partner had been called into an emergency board meeting, and the entire office was in lockdown. Rumors were flying about a massive internal breach and a high-level executive being investigated. I simply replied, "Wow, sounds crazy." By lunchtime, the first news alerts started to break. A major investment firm had suspended a senior financial advisor pending an investigation into serious financial misconduct. Arthur wasn't named, but I knew it was him. An hour later, Isabel's firm released a similar statement about a suspended vice president. The professional world they had worked so hard to build was crumbling around them in real time. I imagined the panic, the frantic phone calls, the accusations. I imagined Arthur, trapped in a glass-walled conference room, his charm and arrogance melting away under the harsh fluorescent lights of a compliance investigation. But the real show was just beginning. The package I'd sent to the feds was a ticking time bomb, and it had just exploded. This wasn't a quiet internal matter anymore. This was a criminal investigation. Around 3:00 p.m., I saw the first news vans pulling up outside Arthur's sleek, downtown office building. The dominoes were no longer just falling, they were crashing down with seismic force. My part in the public drama was over. Now it was time for the personal touch. I had one final package to deliver. At 4:00 p.m., I sent a single, simple email directly to Arthur's personal address, the one he shared with Isabel. The subject line was "For your presentation." The body of the email contained just one thing: the password-protected PDF I had created, the one with the password ugly6. I knew he'd be checking his personal email, desperate for any information, probably trying to coordinate his story with Isabel. I knew he wouldn't be able to resist opening it. That file was my checkmate. It was the proof that this wasn't an anonymous whistleblower. It was someone who knew him. It was the final, devastating reveal that showed him not only was his professional life over, but his grand new romance was built on a lie he could never escape. He would know, without a doubt, who was responsible for his ruin, and he would know why. As the afternoon wore on, I packed a small bag. I put the designer briefcase he'd bought me in a donation bin. I gathered every gift, every photo, every remnant of our 2 years together and placed them in a single black trash bag. I didn't burn them. They weren't worth the energy. They were just garbage. I called Martha. "Are you free?" I asked, my voice light and clear. "The ice cream and junk food offer, does it still stand?" She was at my door in 20 minutes, her arms full of everything a person needs to celebrate a new beginning. She took one look at my face and her own broke into a wide, knowing smile. "You did it, didn't you?" she said, not as a question, but as a statement. "You got him?" I just nodded. I didn't need to tell her the details. She understood. We spent the evening on my couch, watching a stupid comedy movie and eating cookie dough straight from the tub. We didn't talk about Arthur. We didn't need to. His chapter was over. We talked about the future. About a trip we wanted to take. About my plans to maybe start my own cybersecurity consulting firm one day. For the first time, my future felt entirely my own. It wasn't tied to someone else's ambitions or defined by their perception of me. It was a blank page, and I held the pen. As I went to bed that night, I checked the news one last time. The headlines were everywhere now. Financial advisor Arthur Vance arrested in massive fraud scheme. There was a picture of him being led out of his office in handcuffs, his perfect suit rumpled, his face pale with shock and disbelief. He looked small. He looked weak. He looked like nothing. I turned off my phone, smiled, and fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. The next morning, I woke to the gentle glow of sunlight streaming through my window, not to the blare of an alarm clock. I had taken the day off. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the air in my apartment felt light. The oppressive weight of Arthur's presence, which had lingered long after he was physically gone, had finally lifted. It felt like my home again. I made a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the world go about its business, feeling a profound sense of detachment from the chaos I had unleashed. Out of curiosity, I turned my phone back on. It immediately buzzed itself into a frenzy. The screen lit up with a long list of notifications. 13 missed calls from an unknown number, a string of panicked voicemails, and dozens of text messages. They were all from Arthur. The timing of the calls started late last night, after his arrest and release on bail, and went all the way into the early hours of the morning. His initial messages were furious. "Claire, you did this. You psycho, you ruined me. Picking up the phone, you coward. Face me." Then, as the hours wore on, the tone shifted from rage to disbelief and desperation. "How could you, after everything we had? Please, Claire, we can fix this. Just tell them you made it up. Tell them you were angry. I can give you money, whatever you want." The final few messages, sent just before dawn, were the most pathetic of all. They were pleas for mercy from a man who had never shown any. "You've destroyed my life. Everything is gone. Please, I'm begging you." I listened to the voicemails, his voice cracking with a mixture of fear and his trademark arrogance, as if he still couldn't quite believe that I, the boring 6, had been capable of orchestrating his complete and utter demise. There was no apology, no remorse for what he'd done to me. It was all about what I had done to him. He was the victim. Of course. I deleted the messages and blocked his number without a second thought. He was just noise now, static from a dead channel. His pleas meant nothing to me. My actions were never about getting an apology or making him feel bad. They were about consequences. He had built a life on the idea that he was above them, that his charm and money could insulate him from the repercussions of his actions. I had simply held up a mirror and forced him to look at the monster he had created. A quick search online filled in the rest of the blanks. Jack had also been arrested. Isabel had been fired and was being investigated as a co-conspirator. The news reports detailed the extent of their fraud, praising the anonymous whistleblower who had brought the scheme to light with such meticulous detail. The authorities had frozen all of Arthur's known assets. The money, the cars, the fancy apartment, all gone, pending the outcome of a trial he was almost certain to lose. He had lost everything he valued, because the only things he valued were material. The best part, the detail that made me truly smile, was a small mention in a financial gossip column. Apparently, Arthur's first call after being released wasn't to a lawyer, but to Isabel. He had accused her of setting him up, of being the whistleblower. She, in turn, accused him of being sloppy and getting them both caught. The power couple, the intellectual equals, had turned on each other at the first sign of trouble. Their great romance, built on a foundation of shared corruption, had crumbled into bitter accusations. He would never trust her again. She would despise him forever. I hadn't just exposed them, I had poisoned the very thing they had betrayed me for. That was true revenge. I spent the rest of the day reclaiming my life. I went to the gym. I bought a new, brightly colored dress just because I could. I met Martha for lunch and we laughed until our sides hurt. I felt reborn. The experience had been excruciating, but it had forged me into someone stronger, someone who knew her own worth with absolute certainty. I no longer needed anyone else's validation. My skills, my intelligence, my character, they were mine, and they were formidable. Arthur's mistake wasn't just underestimating my abilities, it was underestimating my spirit. He thought he could break me, but he had only broken the chains that were holding me back. That evening, I sat in my quiet, peaceful apartment, thinking about his final, pathetic words to me in the restaurant. "A girl like you should be grateful I even dated you." He was right, in a way. I was grateful. I was grateful that he showed me his true colors. I was grateful that he pushed me to my limit, forcing me to discover a strength I never knew I had. And most of all, I was grateful that he was out of my life, a distant memory, a cautionary tale. As I looked out at the city skyline, a future of endless possibilities stretching out before me, I smiled. It was a quiet, calm, and utterly victorious smile. He had his 13 missed calls. I had my new dawn, and it was beautiful.